Hello everyone. Today we're going to learn how to buff. I am going to take you through the buffing area so that you understand what to expect when you are doing the final parts of the finishing process. Before we discuss the buffing procedures, I want to make sure that you understand that you'll need to file and sand things to perfection before you start to buff. If you don't, your piece will still have scratches in it when you complete the process, and you won't receive full credit for the piece you are creating because we are trying to teach you professional hand skills. Remember, buffing is the last part of the finishing process, so you have to go through all the grits of sandpaper to ensure there are no scratches or dents in your work before you buff. When you buff, you can see in this diagram that the tripoli, the brown compound, is first, and the rouge, the red or purple compound, is second. That is because the tripoli compound has larger particles in it than rouge, so it's used first. Remember, as you're buffing, you're going to want to use the bottom quarter of the buffing wheel, as you can see in this image. This piece still had scratches and dents in it. Here is another that has the 600 sandpaper scratches all going the same direction with no additional dents and is ready for buffing. When you are back in the buffing area, it's important to note that the tripoli buffing wheel is on the left and the rouge buffing wheel is on the right. Everything is labeled to help you make the correct choices when buffing. Each area has the cloth necessary for buffing, the compound, other tools for the process, and a hand broom for cleaning when you are finished. Above the buffing wheel, there are buffing sticks, tightly bound buffs and looser buffs, ring buffs, and the buffing rake. The middle section has hand vices, sanding mandrels, and wood blocks on the counter for more delicate work. The rouge area on the right has the same equipment, but designated for rouge. It's extremely important to keep the compounds separate or you will create work that is scratched, which again means it loses points because of poor craftsmanship skills. So now that you're introduced to the buffing station, I'm going to show you the first part of the process, which is using tripoli. As you notice, I took off my sweatshirt and I put on a smock so that I'm not getting buffing compound all over my good clothes. I'm also going to put on my safety glasses, which will go over my glasses. I also have a larger set of safety glasses that will fit over larger glasses if you need them. I'm also going to tie my hair back. So I'm just going to take this clip and make sure that I tie my hair back and put this part behind my ear since it doesn't want to stay. Ooh. Put it behind the glasses, I guess, just so that everything is off my face. The other thing I'm going to do is take off my bracelet and rings so that I am not getting that all full of buffing compound. A couple of things before we start is you'll notice I have my tripoli cloth and my rouge cloth. I'm going to put the rouge over by the rouge area and I'm going to put my cloth down for right now. I'm not actually going to need my cloth until I'm ready to wipe things off with the parts that I'm working with. So I'm going to show you first how to actually put the buff on the buffing wheel. The first thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to take hold of the buffing wheel itself. And also, as you're doing this, you really should make sure that the buffing wheel is unplugged. So I'm just going to do that back here in the back of the station just to make sure that I'm being really safe. So I'm just going to hang on to it with my hand and I'm going to take the buff and I'm going to actually rotate backwards because that's what's going to actually strengthen it onto the mandrel here. I also want you to notice before I do that I have a T on this buff. And if you notice behind the buffing wheels, there are buffs that are bound together that you would use first, and then there are buffs that are more loose that you would use toward the end. So I'm just going to hold the mandrel and I'm going to twist this backwards. So I'm actually rotating back toward the wall in order to get the buff on the buffing wheel. And I want to do this until it actually stops, until I can't go any further. Part of the reason I'm showing you this is if there ever is not a buff on here, you need to know how to change the buffs. So again, if you need to take it off, you need to hold on the buffing wheel and you need to go the opposite direction. So I'm actually now coming forward toward me in order to get the buff off of that mandrel. So once the buff is on the buffing wheel, I can plug the buffing wheel back in. Again, we're just trying to make sure that we're safe, so we always unplug things before we try to change the equipment. What you also need to notice is there's a high and a low on the buffing wheel itself. You need to make sure that you have the buffing wheel on high and also that you have the ventilation on. So I'm just going to turn this on right now so that you can hear what it sounds like. You also notice that a light came on when I'm doing this. I'm also going to put a mask on when I'm done explaining what to do, and then I will actually show you how to do the buffing part separately. As you're buffing, you really want to push pretty hard on the buff itself in order to create enough pressure and friction that's going to make that piece shiny. So again, we want to go the opposite direction of our sanding. I have the sanding going horizontal right now. If I hold this underneath, I want to make sure that I can see the horizontal marks, and I'm going to go underneath because the buffing wheel is again going to rotate this direction at me, and I have the sanding going the opposite direction. One other thing that I want to show you before we get started is when the buffs get really, really dirty, and actually you sometimes can see metal on them, what you need to do is take the buffing rake and you're going to need to rake it off from underneath. And I will show you that also when I have my mask on, but it's going to be harder to hear. And so I'm going to just introduce that right now as well. Some of you might be wondering why we have things like wood blocks over here, but those pierced pieces that we just finished, actually you would probably need to put the pierced piece on a piece of wood block and then on the buffing wheel. Sometimes if you don't support something that has a lot of piercings in it, it'll actually bend your piece. So you really want to make sure that you're supporting things so that the buffing wheel does not wreck what you already have done. So this is the part where I'm going to actually start buffing, at least with Tripoli on this part. I'm going to put on my mask and then I'm going to start buffing. It's going to be harder for you to hear me, and I might fog up my glasses, so I put them over the top of the nose part, and hopefully you can see the nose part of the mask is actually got a metal piece to it. So I'm going to put the glasses over the top of that, and hopefully you notice also I have a label on my mask. You should all be doing that as well. You should be keeping them in your locker. We've talked about that before. I'm going to turn this on, and I'm also going to turn on the ventilation, which also turns on a light. It gets very, very loud. What I need to do now is I'm going to put a little bit of the buffing compound on the buffing wheel itself, and then I'm going to hold underneath here my piece of metal, and hopefully you can see the difference where I buffed and where I didn't. As soon as it comes off of the buffing wheel, I want to wipe with my cloth that again has that T on it. The reason that I want this cloth right now by itself is that the Tripoli compound actually is more coarse than the rouge. And we talked about that in the initial finishing process. So this is what it looks like after you've buffed with Tripoli. I would want to go and do my entire piece, which I will do before I go and move to rouge. I'm going to show you how much different it looks when I have done it with rouge versus the Tripoli. So I actually turned the ventilation off for a moment in order to rake this, just so that you could hear me. Again, when you take the rake, you would go underneath and you want to go back and forth on the buff, and what you're doing is you're cleaning off the compound. You especially want to do this if there's any metal on the buff, because that would actually scratch your piece. So another thing that you want to think about when you are buffing is that if you have to use a hand vise, you are going to want to wrap your piece in a piece of cloth. So I just have my piece of cloth here. I'm going to make sure that there aren't any loose edges. So I'm going to wrap it around my piece like this. Then I'm going to take the hand vise and I'm going to put it around the piece, and then there's a little wedge that has to go in between the section over there to make this so that it doesn't move. Then what I would do is I'm actually going to put buffing compound on the wheel, and I would hold that underneath the buff on that bottom quarter like we had talked about before. Another type of hand vise that we have. They look like this. You can actually put your piece inside there and then take the little wing nut and actually crank that down until, again, it actually doesn't move on here. Again, it's a really good idea to protect your piece with a piece of cloth so that you don't scratch all the sanding that you've just been doing. If your piece is really, really delicate, like this one over here, you would actually take a piece of wood from the wood block area. It's in between the two buffing wheels. And then you would actually put your piece on that wood block, and then you could actually go and buff underneath so that it's supported. That way it doesn't bend on you as you're working. If you are doing something like a bracelet or a ring, there are ring buffs over here. You can also use these for bracelets, but there's actually a bracelet buff as well. It's a little tricky getting that on and off, so a lot of people like to use the ring buffs for bracelets as well. In addition to that, there's actually a sanding mandrel that you can put onto the mandrel that's on the buffing wheel itself. The sanding mandrel is just like the one that we would use with the buffing wheel. There's a little slit in here where you would put the sandpaper. You would put it onto the mandrel that's back here in the buff, and then you would actually put sandpaper on there in order to sand your piece. So here I have my piece totally buffed. Hopefully you guys can see. It's super, super shiny. I only have it done with tripoli though, so I'm going to mark it now with a Sharpie down half the way, and then I'm going to buff with rouge so you can see the difference. So now I've made my way over to the rouge station, and I'm going to show you how to actually buff with rouge. It's the same process, same putting the buffs on, same using the rake, same cleaning, but what you're going to do is you're going to go the opposite direction. So you really have to see what direction you went. I went horizontally with the tripoli, and I'm going to want to go vertical now with the rouge. I've got my rouge cloth ready to go, and I'm just going to need to put on the buffing compound just like I did before. Before I do that, I'm going to put on my mask, and then I'm going to also turn on the ventilation, which will get very loud in a moment. So I'm opening up the area where I'm buffing, and then I'm going to go perpendicular to the direction I went last time. So I'm actually going to go this direction because I went horizontal before. I actually forgot to put the compound on, so I'm going to put a little bit of the compound on the buff, and then I'm going to go vertically, and you can see I went a little too far and it almost grabbed the piece of metal from me. You do have to be careful. This gets hot as you're doing it. So after I've done that, I'm going to want to wipe away any residue that's on here with my cloth. Here you can see a piece of metal that has been buffed. On the right side you can see the tripoli, and on the left side you can see the rouge. Notice how much more mirror-like the shine is when you use rouge. As I show you an even closer up image of the rouge and the tripoli, here I want you to notice the scratch that is in the rouge because it wasn't removed with the sandpaper to begin with. So another thing that we need to talk about is using the ultrasonic cleaner. Sometimes after you buff a piece, you might notice that there's some of the compound still stuck in there. So whether or not we talked about it before, as soon as you're done buffing, you're going to want to take your cloth. This one happens to be a rouge cloth. It was the last one that I was using. I rubbed all of the compound off of there while it was still warm over in the buffing area. But what I noticed is that inside this tiny little groove over here, I actually have some compound still in there. In order to get that out, you can use the ultrasonic cleaners. Basically what they do is they are a container that is filled with water. So here I actually have some water. I'm gonna just dump some into the smaller ultrasonic cleaner. I've got a smaller piece here, so I don't need to use the really large ultrasonic over on this other side. I actually took some warm water, and I'm dumping the warm water in the ultrasonic cleaner. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open this cabinet Inside the cabinet, you can see that there's some dish soap in here. I'm going to take the dish soap and just put 1 drop of cleaner. That was actually 2, that's gonna be fine. In both of the containers because I didn't put any soap in there to begin with. Then what I will do is they are actually plugged in and I'm going to turn them on. And you can hear it makes a noise. What the ultrasonic cleaner is doing is it's actually vibrating inside there. And when you put your piece in the cleaner and you let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes, it's going to vibrate all of those. It's going to remove the leftover compound from the buffing area. When you pick it back out, if there's still a little bit of compound in it, you can actually use toothbrushes from over by the sink. You do have to be very, very gentle as you are rubbing on that because you could potentially scratch your piece with the toothbrush. You want to rub very gently as you're doing that. And then when you're finished, you can actually rinse it with water and then dry it off again with that cloth that has the C on it because that is a clean cloth. Another thing that you need to think about when you're using the ultrasonic cleaners is this smaller one has the power switch. Right now it's on the left-hand side. If it gets turned around, it might end up being on the right, so you do have to kind of figure that out. The other larger ultrasonic cleaner actually has a power button and you can actually even set it for specific temperatures. So once I turn it on, I can set different temperatures if I want, and then I can actually cover it with the lid when I'm finished. And again, this one has a basket in it, which is really kind of nice because you can pull things in and out. It's really intended for larger pieces. And I'm going to turn it off because I'm not using it. Right now, I'm also going to turn off the other ultrasonic cleaner. Part of the reason I did that is the vibration that's in there. If you go to put your hand in there and you have any sort of issues with like your knuckles or your joints, putting your hand in there when it's still on actually irritates sometimes the knuckles and bones. So again, I'm just going to take this toothbrush and I'm going to rub out where the compound was in those tiny little spaces inside my piece. So that's going to, again, help take out any compound that's in unusual places when you're finished. I'm going to try to take my clean cloth and wipe the rest of this off, and then I'll show you where I removed the compound. So right in here, sometimes you might even have some texture inside a piece that you make. So here you can see the person has a back part of this pendant that is a basketball hoop, and there's texture inside it, and hopefully if I get kind of close you can see that there's a little bit of compound still stuck inside there. When you put that type in the ultrasonic cleaner, you want to put it in with the textured side so that the compound would fall out of the piece. And I would suggest letting it sit for about 10 minutes or so in here, just to make sure that all that vibration and as much of the compound gets out as possible. Once you're finished with that, you can then take the toothbrush and actually clean that, and I'll show you that when I'm taking it out. So it's been about 10 minutes and I'm going to turn the ultrasonic cleaner off. I'm going to fish my piece out of here and I can actually see in the bottom, and it's even a little bit red from the rouge that's in here. I can see what was going on with that. I'm just going to get my toothbrush a little bit wet and just gently I'm scrubbing on here to get parts of this off, and I'll try to come a little bit closer so that you can see that. So here you can see I'm really close to my piece, and if I just gently rub with the toothbrush, the compound comes out of the textured areas, and you can actually see that the water's getting a little bit dark there. So I can tell that it's actually working. So again, I'm just rubbing in a circular motion with my toothbrush in order to get the rest of the compound out from the textured and piercing areas that I have in this piece of jewelry. Once I feel like I've gotten everything out that I can, I'm going to take the rest of the cloth And I'm actually going to go in here and dry this. Once I've dried the pieces, hopefully you can see that it's better than it was before. It might still be a little bit wet here on this side. Here are the before and after images of the ultrasonic cleaner. The first image, you'll notice that there's a lot of residue from the compound still left. And when we see the second image, you'll notice that all of that compound has been removed. One other thing you need to think about is when you are finished buffing for the day, whatever part you're on, and the teacher, I'm going to make whoever was buffing that day clean things up, but you can see there's a bunch of things inside these bins that are underneath here. You would take this over to the trash and dump them out so that everything's clean, and then we're going to put them back at the end of the hour. Here I am over by the trash can. I just want to dump that all out as much as I can. So one other thing you have to think about is you do get residue all over your fingers as you are buffing. You want to make sure that you go and wash your hands so that you don't ingest any of that residue or metal into your body.